Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The morning sun bled across the Giza Plateau, turning the ancient stones to gold. Dr. Thomas Reed stood before the Sphinx with his hand pressed against its weathered flank, feeling the deep grooves carved into limestone that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. 20 years he'd spent studying these monuments, and in all that time one question had gnawed at him with increasing urgency. "Look at this," he said to the camera crew setting up behind him, his fingers tracing the erosion patterns. "Water did this, heavy sustained rainfall over centuries, but Egypt hasn't seen weather like that since the African humid period ended 8,000 years ago." Lisa Hart adjusted her documentary camera, capturing the intensity in his weathered face. She'd been following Thomas's work for almost a year now, watching his obsession deepen from academic curiosity into something that bordered on desperate need. "You're saying the Sphinx is older than the pyramids?" Thomas turned to face her, and in his eyes was something between excitement and dread. "I'm saying everything we've been taught about human history might be a comfortable lie. What if these structures weren't built 4,500 years ago by Bronze Age Egyptians? What if they're remnants of something far older, something we've deliberately forgotten?" He walked along the Sphinx's enclosure, pointing to the layers of weathering that descended in vertical patterns down the walls. "Look at this erosion. It's consistent with prolonged exposure to heavy precipitation, rain falling for centuries, maybe thousands of years. But the last time this region saw that kind of rainfall was at the end of the last ice age. We're talking about 10, 12, maybe 15,000 years ago." Lisa zoomed in on the weathering patterns, the stone telling stories that mainstream archaeology refused to hear, but that would mean the Sphinx predates ancient Egypt by thousands of years. "At minimum," Thomas agreed, his voice carrying the weight of certainty that comes from years of evidence gathering. "And if the Sphinx is that old, what about the pyramids themselves? What about the foundations they stand on? I've examined the base stones of the Great Pyramid, the ones buried under sand and rubble that no tourist ever sees. The weathering on those stones matches the Sphinx perfectly. They're the same age, Lisa. They have to be." 3 weeks later, Thomas stood in a circle of generator lights that pushed back the February desert night like desperate hands against an encroaching tide. Around him, drilling equipment hummed and rattled, boring down through 400 feet of limestone and sand into secrets that had been sealed before the first pharaoh drew breath. The Egyptian authorities had given them 2 weeks, 14 days to prove or disprove a theory that would either revolutionize human history or confirm his colleagues' suspicions that he'd finally crossed the line from visionary to madman. Dr. Yuki Tanaka hunched over his seismic equipment, the blue glow of monitors painting his face with ghostly light. The Japanese seismologist had been still for so long that Thomas almost didn't notice him at first, but there was something in Yuki's posture that suggested he'd found something he desperately wished he hadn't. His hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly, as if afraid to confirm what the data was showing him. "Thomas?" Yuki's voice was barely above a whisper, the kind of quiet that comes when speaking louder might make something terrible more real. "Come look at this. Please tell me I'm reading this wrong." The monitor showed the subterranean architecture in stark relief, rendered in shades of green and blue that should have been beautiful but instead felt ominous. Chambers, corridors, a network of spaces that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist. Yet, there they were, on the screen with undeniable clarity. The stone showed perfectly smooth walls at a depth where no ancient civilization should have been able to work, where the pressure of the earth alone should have made construction impossible. The density readings, Yuki continued, his finger trembling slightly as it traced the screen. This stone was placed and sealed before the pyramids were built. Thomas, I'm talking thousands of years before. Maybe tens of thousands. The geological signature suggests this was done during the last ice age, when this entire region looked completely different. Professor David Okonkwo joined them, his tall frame casting long shadows in the generator light. The archaeologist from Lagos had specialized in pre-dynastic Egypt, spending decades studying the earliest traces of Egyptian civilization, but nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for this moment. Human civilization barely existed 10,000 years ago. We were hunter-gatherers, nomads following game herds. We didn't have the technology or social organization for projects like this. Thomas stared at the readings, feeling the world tilt slightly beneath his feet, the familiar desert sand suddenly feeling like treacherous ground. Then, either our equipment is catastrophically wrong, every sensor and reading giving us false information, or everything we think we know about our past is fiction. Comfortable stories we've told ourselves because the truth was too disturbing to accept. He pulled up a chair next to Yuki, studying the seismic images more closely. The chambers weren't just deep, they were massive, some of them appearing to be larger than aircraft hangars, carved from solid bedrock with a precision that would be impressive with modern diamond-tipped equipment and hydraulic excavators, let alone stone tools from the Ice Age. "Run the scan again," Thomas said, his voice tight with barely controlled anticipation and dread. "Triple check everything. I want to be absolutely certain before we proceed. If we're wrong about this, we're just another crackpot expedition that wasted everyone's time and money. But if we're right..." Yuki nodded and initiated another sweep, adjusting parameters and running multiple verification protocols. The results came back identical, the data refusing to change no matter how many times they checked it. Whatever lay beneath them was real, ancient beyond comprehension, and waiting to be discovered. The wrongness began on the third day, subtle at first, easy to dismiss. Small things that could be explained away individually, but together formed a pattern of increasing unease. Thomas's compass spinning lazily in circles, unable to find magnetic north, as if the fundamental laws of physics bent differently here. Electronic devices flickering and dying without explanation, batteries draining in minutes when they should have lasted hours. Yuki's carefully calibrated instruments showing readings that made no physical sense, as if the laws of nature bent differently in the space beneath the plateau. "It's electromagnetic interference," Yuki explained, though his voice lacked conviction, the certainty of a scientist confronted with phenomena that shouldn't exist. "But I can't isolate the source. It's not coming from any single point. It's coming from everywhere down there, as if the stone itself is generating some kind of field, or as if something in those chambers is actively producing interference." Thomas watched as another of their backup hard drives corrupted, the data turning to digital noise before their eyes. Months of preparation and documentation vanishing into electronic chaos. What could generate a field like this, and why would it still be active after thousands of years? Nothing maintains power that long without a source. "I don't know," Yuki admitted, his scientific training warring with observations that defied explanation. "I've never seen anything like it. The only comparable readings I've encountered were near certain meteorite impact sites, where the extreme pressure and heat created magnetic anomalies in the rock. But this is different. This is organized somehow, structured, almost like it's being deliberately generated." David had spent the day exploring the known chambers of the Great Pyramid, camera in hand, documenting every inch of the ancient structure that tourists climbed through without understanding what they were really seeing. When he returned to camp that evening, Thomas knew immediately that something had shaken him to his core. The archaeologist's usual academic composure had cracked, revealing something raw and frightened underneath. "I found writing," David said, pulling up photographs on his laptop with hands that shook slightly, "in one of the sealed shafts that the restoration teams opened last year. Hieroglyphics, but wrong. The style is proto-dynastic at best, possibly older. Some of the symbols don't match any known Egyptian writing system. And Thomas, they're not about construction or royal decrees or religious ceremonies." The symbols covered the shaft walls in desperate, almost frantic repetition, carved with uneven strokes that suggested urgency bordering on panic. Thomas leaned closer, trying to make sense of the ancient warnings, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. "What do they say?" David's throat worked as he swallowed, his academic distance stripped away by the raw fear in the ancient words. "Do not descend into the deep places. The earth below holds death beyond death. What sleeps in darkness must never wake. Guard the seals with your lives and the lives of your children's children. Let no generation forget what we have buried. Let no curiosity unseal what terror has locked away." He looked up, his eyes haunted by the weight of millennia-old terror. "It's the same message over and over, Thomas. Different phrases, different hands, but always the same warning. They weren't trying to inform future generations. They were begging them, pleading with anyone who might find these chambers to leave them sealed, to walk away, to forget they ever existed." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night, a primal unease that spoke to something deeper than rational thought. Begging who? Future generations. "Maybe," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or maybe they were begging themselves, reminding themselves why they couldn't go back down, why they had to maintain the seals no matter what, no matter how much they wanted to understand what they'd found. These aren't royal proclamations or religious texts. These are the desperate words of people who'd seen something that terrified them so deeply they spent the rest of their lives making sure no one else would ever see it. And they wanted their children to maintain that fear, and their children's children forever." Lisa had been filming the exchange, her camera capturing the growing unease in the camp, the way the drilling crew had become quieter, more nervous, as if they could sense that they were touching something that should remain untouched. What could scare ancient people badly enough to carve warnings like this? They faced predators, disease, starvation, warfare. They lived brutal lives. What could be worse than everything they already endured? No one answered because none of them wanted to voice the possibilities forming in their minds, the terrible implications of warnings that had lasted for thousands of years. The drill broke through on day 7. The bit had been grinding through solid limestone for hours, the sound of it echoing across the dark plateau, when suddenly it dropped, the resistance vanishing as it punched into void. The crew erupted in celebration, but Thomas felt only a creeping sense of violation, as if they'd broken something that should have remained whole, shattered a seal that had been placed for reasons they didn't yet understand. "Air composition?" he asked, his voice cutting through the excitement like a knife through celebration. Yuki studied his instruments, frowning at the results, running the analysis 3 times before accepting what they showed. "Sealed environment. The air down there hasn't circulated in at least 12,000 years, possibly much longer. Whatever's in that chamber has been cut off from the surface since the Ice Age. The atmospheric composition is strange though. Higher oxygen content than current air, consistent with what Earth's atmosphere was like during the Pleistocene epoch. It's like the air down there is a preserved sample from a different world." "That's impossible," one of the drilling technicians said, a burly Egyptian man who'd been working archaeological sites for 2 decades. "Air doesn't just stay frozen in time like that." "It does if the seal is perfect," Yuki replied, his voice carrying the weight of implications he was only beginning to understand. "If there's been absolutely no exchange with the outside atmosphere, for thousands of years, but that would require engineering precision that shouldn't exist in the ancient world. Seals that could last through earthquakes, geological shifts, the rise and fall of entire civilizations. They descended on a platform lowered by cable. 3 people swallowed by darkness that their lights could barely penetrate. Thomas, Yuki, and the head drilling technician, a quiet man named Ahmed, who'd been working archaeological sites in Egypt for 30 years and had never encountered anything like this. The void that opened around them was immense, a cathedral carved from living rock. Thomas's breath clouded in air that felt wrong somehow, too heavy, too still, as if it had forgotten how to move, as if it had been waiting for this moment for thousands of years. Ahmed muttered a prayer in Arabic as the platform descended, his knuckles white on the safety railing, his eyes wide in the darkness. In 30 years, I've never felt anything like this. This place, it doesn't want us here. Can you feel it? Like the stone itself is watching us. The corridor stretched beyond their lights in both directions, walls carved with a precision that made modern engineering seem crude by comparison. But it wasn't the craftsmanship that made Thomas's heart hammer against his ribs, like it was trying to escape his chest. It was the markings. Symbols and diagrams covered every available surface, dense with information and something else, something that felt like panic preserved in stone, terror given permanent form. "These are star charts," Yuki breathed, his light tracing the intricate patterns that covered the ceiling and upper walls. "But the constellations are wrong. The positions are all shifted. These aren't the stars as they appear now." Thomas studied them with growing unease, his astronomical knowledge allowing him to recognize patterns, even if they were millennia out of date. He'd seen reconstructions of ancient skies in academic papers, computer models showing how the stars had appeared thousands of years ago due to axial precession and stellar motion. But this was different. This was precise, detailed, created by people who'd spent years, maybe generations, mapping the heavens with obsessive accuracy. "These show the night sky as it appeared over 15,000 years ago," he said slowly, his voice echoing strangely in the vast corridor. "Before the last ice age ended, before agriculture, before the first permanent settlements, before everything we consider the beginning of civilization. Whoever made these charts was documenting a world we can barely imagine." Ahmed's light swept across the opposite wall, revealing more diagrams that made all 3 men freeze. These weren't astronomical charts. They were biological illustrations, anatomical drawings of creatures that looked almost human, but disturbingly wrong in ways that violated every instinct. The proportions were off, the limbs too long and jointed in too many places, the skulls elongated in ways that suggested something fundamental was different about their neurology. "What are those?" Ahmed asked, his voice tight with barely suppressed fear. "What kind of creatures are those?" Thomas approached the drawings, his scientific curiosity warring with a primal instinct that told him to run, to flee back to the surface and seal the hole they'd drilled and never speak of this place again. "I don't know. They look like anatomical studies, detailed biological documentation, but not of humans, not of any animal I recognize. The skeletal structure is wrong, the musculature is configured differently. These are the drawings of something that evolved along a completely different pathway." At the corridor's terminus stood a massive barrier of black granite, fitted so precisely into the surrounding bedrock that not even a knife blade could slip between the joints. The surface was covered in symbols, but these were different from the star charts and anatomical drawings. These were warnings hammered into stone with desperate urgency, the symbols deep and emphatic, carved by hands that wanted to ensure their message would outlast empires. David ran his hands over the granite when they brought him down later that day, his archaeological training warring with what his instincts were screaming at him. "This isn't a door," he said finally. his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Look at the construction. The way it's sealed from this side with multiple redundant layers. This was designed to keep something in, not to keep people out. Every aspect of this seal is about preventing something from breaking through from the other side." The seal itself was a marvel of ancient engineering that would have impressed modern architects. Multiple layers of granite blocks, each one weighing several tons, fitted together in an interlocking pattern that would require deliberate dismantling to breach. Bronze or copper wedges had been driven into specially cut slots, expanding with age to hold the blocks in place with crushing force. The ancient builders had been absolutely determined that this seal would never fail. "Whoever sealed this," Thomas said, running his hands along the joints and feeling the perfect fit that had endured for millennia. They wanted to make absolutely certain it couldn't be opened from the other side. They wanted it to be difficult to open from this side too. This wasn't meant to keep grave robbers out of a tomb full of treasure. This was meant to keep something imprisoned, to contain something that absolutely could not be allowed to escape. 3 days to remove the seal. 72 hours of careful work, documenting every step, aware that they might be the first humans to breach this barrier since the ice sheets covered Europe and mammoths walked the earth. They used diamond-tipped saws to cut through the bronze wedges, hydraulic jacks to separate the granite blocks millimetre by millimetre, each one requiring hours of patient labour and constant monitoring. As they worked, David translated more of the symbols carved into the seal itself, and his expression grew darker with each passage he decoded, each ancient warning he gave voice to. "These aren't just warnings," he said on the second day of dismantling, his voice shaking as he read symbols that had been carved with desperate intensity. "They're instructions, procedures for maintaining the seal. They specify that the seals must be checked every generation, reinforced if necessary, maintained in perpetuity. They describe how to identify if something is trying to break through from below, what sounds to listen for, what vibrations to fear." He paused, his finger tracing a particularly deep carving that looked like it had been hammered into the stone with violent force. "And they describe what to do if the seal ever breaks. The instructions are very specific. Collapse the entire chamber system. Bury it under 1,000 tons of rubble. Do not attempt to reseal it. Do not attempt to investigate what breached it. Do not try to understand what you've released. Just bury it and run as far as you can and never return." "Why?" Lisa asked, her camera focused on David's troubled face, capturing the fear that had crept into his eyes. "If something breaks out, why not try to contain it? Why just run?" David's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, because once they're awake, the text says it's already too late. There is no containing them. There is only survival, and that only if you run fast enough, and far enough that they lose interest in pursuing you. When the final granite block came free with a grinding sound that seemed to echo forever, ancient air rushed out like a death rattle, carrying the scent of deep earth and something else, something organic and old, and fundamentally wrong. The smell was faint but unmistakable, like decay but not quite, like something had been rotting for so long that it had passed through putrefaction into something else entirely, some new state that had no name in human experience. The chamber beyond stole the breath from Thomas's lungs and replaced it with ice-cold dread. Vast didn't begin to describe it. The space stretched into darkness that their lights couldn't penetrate, even with industrial-strength LED arrays that should have illuminated a football field, and every surface, every wall from floor to ceiling, was covered in stone tablets. Thousands of them, tens of thousands perhaps, arranged in careful rows that spoke of obsessive documentation, of desperate need to preserve information for whoever might someday find this place. "This is a library," David whispered, his voice echoing in the enormous dark like a prayer in a cathedral. An archive. They were trying to preserve something, to pass information forward to whoever found this place. This is the accumulated knowledge of an entire civilization, carved in stone because they knew it had to survive millennia. Lisa's cameras captured everything, the red recording lights like distant stars in the enormous dark, creating pools of crimson that seemed to pulse like living things. David began the work of translation, and as the hours passed, as he moved from tablet to tablet with increasing agitation, the story that emerged was impossible, the kind of thing that should exist only in nightmares or ancient mythology, not carved in stone with documentary precision. The tablets were organized by subject matter with almost modern library science precision. Some documented astronomical observations covering thousands of years, tracking cycles and patterns with meticulous accuracy. Others contained what appeared to be historical records, genealogies of ancient peoples whose names had been lost to time, whose entire civilizations had risen and fallen without leaving any other trace. But the tablets that dominated the archive, the ones that had been given the most prominent position in the center of the chamber, told a story that shouldn't exist. These were written by humans, David said, his voice echoing in the chamber with a hollow quality. Ancient humans, but not ancient as we understand it. Not the ancient Egyptians or Sumerians or any civilization we know. These people existed before recorded history, before the first cities, before agriculture changed everything, and they didn't build the pyramids above us as tombs for kings or temples for gods. Then what were they for? Thomas asked, though part of him already knew the answer would be terrible, could feel it in the weight of the stone around them, in the desperate care with which these tablets had been arranged. David's hands shook as he photographed another tablet, his academic composure completely shattered. They were markers, warnings, seals placed over something that had to be contained at any cost. The tablets describe another species, Thomas. Something that existed on Earth before humanity became dominant. They call them the builders who came before, and according to these records, they vanished suddenly, approximately 50,000 years ago. The words hung in the still air like a curse, like knowledge that once learned could never be forgotten. Thomas forced himself to think scientifically, to approach this as data rather than nightmare, though his hands were shaking and his mouth had gone dry. Vanished how? The tablets don't say exactly, but they describe a great dying, a catastrophe that swept across the world in what they call the time of cold sun. The builders who came before, these creatures that had dominated Earth for longer than these ancient humans could count, began to sicken and die. Within a single generation they were gone, or almost gone. David moved to another section of tablets, these ones carved with even more frantic urgency, the symbols deeper and more emphatic. Our ancestors, the humans who survived that period, they found the places where these creatures had lived, found their remains, found their cities buried in sediment and time, and they did something our species has rarely done since. They left those places alone. More than that, they sealed them. They spent generations deliberately burying the cities, collapsing the tunnels, filling the chambers with rock and earth, and then they built monuments on top to mark the graves for future generations. Monuments so massive they could never be forgotten, never be eroded away by time. But why? Yuki asked, his scientific mind struggling to process implications that seemed to violate everything they knew about human prehistory. If these creatures were already dead, why go to such lengths? Why spend generations burying them? David's finger traced a line of symbols, his translation coming slowly as if he was reluctant to give voice to the words, as if speaking them aloud might make them more real. Because they weren't all dead. Some of them survived, small numbers, scattered groups, weakened but not extinct. And our ancestors discovered something terrifying about these creatures. They could enter states of dormancy, suspended animation that could last for decades or centuries. The tablets describe finding them in their underground chambers, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, lying still as stone, neither breathing nor decomposing, existing in some state between life and death. He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Our ancestors didn't know if they were dead or sleeping. They didn't know if those still, silent forms might wake someday. So they made a choice. They sealed them in. They buried them so deep that even if they woke, they could never dig their way out. They entombed them in the deepest parts of the earth and built mountains of stone on top to ensure the seals would never be broken. Thomas felt his scientific worldview cracking like ice under pressure, the comfortable certainties of his education shattering against the weight of evidence carved in stone. That's not possible. No vertebrate species can survive that kind of suspended animation. The cellular damage alone would be fatal. Metabolism has to continue at some level or death occurs. We can't, David agreed, his eyes reflecting the terrible understanding they were all beginning to share. Humans can't. No mammal we know of can. But according to these tablets, they could. The ancient writers describe it as a kind of death that isn't death, a transformation into stone-like stillness. The creatures would become cold, rigid, their bodies hardening until they seemed to be statues rather than living things. They could remain in that state for longer than human memory. And when conditions were right, when something disturbed them, or when enough time had passed, they could wake. They could return to life as if no time had passed at all. The team spent hours in the archive, photographing tablets, documenting everything with frantic energy, aware that what they were discovering would change human history if they could bring the evidence back to the surface. The story that emerged was consistent across thousands of stone records, told from multiple perspectives but always describing the same terrible truth. An ancient human civilization, more sophisticated than modern archaeology gave them credit for, had faced something that nearly destroyed them. Not a natural disaster or climate change or warfare with other humans. They'd faced an intelligent predator species that had dominated Earth for millions of years, and they'd won not through superior strength or technology, but through patience and time and sheer desperate stubbornness. They'd outlasted their predators, survived long enough for the creatures to die off, or enter their dormant state, and then they'd taken deliberate steps to ensure those creatures could never return. Thomas had sent samples of the chamber walls to a lab he trusted, a facility in Switzerland run by a former colleague who asked few questions if you paid well enough and promised interesting results. When the results arrived via encrypted email 3 days later, he read them 3 times, then a 4th, then called the lab on a secure line to confirm there hadn't been an error in processing, that the impossible results were somehow accurate. There had been no error. The technician sounded nervous, frightened even, as he confirmed the results. The granite had been quarried and placed 47,000 years ago. This predates everything, Yuki said, staring at the results, with the expression of a man watching his understanding of reality crumble into dust. 47,000 years ago, humans were barely using stone tools. We lived in small bands of maybe 20 or 30 people, followed game animals, across the landscape left no permanent structures. The oldest known megalithic site is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, and that's only 11,000 years old. This is 4 times older than that. This is older than cave paintings. This is older than anything we've ever found that suggests organized human activity. But the geological analysis revealed something even more disturbing. Something that made all their previous discoveries seem like preliminaries to the real revelation. The foundation stones of the pyramids above them, the massive blocks that tourists photographed and scholars studied and engineers marveled at, had been cut and placed during the same period as this chamber. The weathering patterns matched perfectly. The tool marks were identical. The stone itself came from the same ancient quarry. The pyramids we see, Thomas said slowly, the implications cascading through his mind, like falling dominoes, each one knocking down comfortable certainties and replacing them with terrifying possibilities, are reconstructions. The ancient Egyptians found these foundations, these impossibly old structures, and they rebuilt them. They thought they were creating something new, making monuments to their gods and kings, but they were just restoring what had been there before, and the original builders, whoever they were, whatever they weren't trying to reach the gods or preserve the bodies of kings. David looked up from another tablet, his face pale in the artificial light, his eyes hollow with the weight of knowledge he wished he could unlearn. They were building prisons, tombs, markers over mass graves. The pyramids were never meant to celebrate anything. They were warnings carved in stone on a scale so massive that they could never be forgotten, never be eroded away by time, never be mistaken for natural formations. They were meant to last until the end of the world, until the sun itself burned out, always standing as testament to what lay buried beneath. Lisa had been reviewing footage from earlier in their exploration, and something caught her attention that made her blood run cold. "Thomas, look at this." She played back video from the corridor outside the archive, the footage showing their initial entry. "See these marks on the walls? I thought they were just natural wear at first, erosion or mineral deposits. But look at the pattern." The marks were regular, repeating every few feet along the corridor, in sets that couldn't possibly be natural. Deep scratches in the limestone, arranged in sets of 4 or 5 parallel lines, each one several inches deep and as long as a man's forearm. "Those look like claw marks," Ahmed said quietly, his voice tight with the kind of fear that comes from confronting something that validates old nightmares. Thomas studied the footage, feeling ice form in his veins, cold spreading through his body like poison. "They are claw marks. Something with significant strength carved these into solid limestone. But look at the depth, the spacing, the angle of penetration. Whatever made these was massive, and it was moving with purpose, not randomly scratching. These marks are deliberate, almost like it was marking territory." The deeper exploration began on day 11, after they'd documented as much of the archive as possible, and the need to understand what lay below became overwhelming. Beyond the tablet chamber, carved into the bedrock itself with the same impossible precision, a spiral staircase descended into depths that made Yuki's equipment register alarm levels he'd never seen outside of active earthquake zones. The stairs were wide enough for 3 people to walk abreast, each step carved with the same precision as the chambers above, worn smooth by something that had used them over countless years. The walls along the descent bore scars that no natural process could explain, no geological force could create. Massive gouges torn through solid limestone, each one deep enough to fit a man's arm inside, arranged in patterns that suggested something with immense strength had clawed its way through the rock, not with tools, not with chisels or picks, with claws, with bare appendages that were harder than stone. "Tool marks?" Lisa asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer and was hoping desperately to be wrong. Thomas ran his fingers along one of the gouges, feeling the stone that had been torn rather than cut, ripped rather than carved. The edges were rough, showing evidence of tremendous force applied in raking motions, like something had been trying to rip through the wall in desperation or rage. No tools made these are claw marks. Something with enough strength to rend limestone climbed these stairs, or tried to. Look at the pattern, the way they're distributed. Whatever made these was trying to get out, trying to claw its way up to the surface. As they descended deeper, the temperature dropping, until their breath came in visible clouds and frost formed on the walls, the gouges became more frequent and more frantic. In some places, the walls looked like they had been attacked with savage desperation, stone torn away in great chunks, sections of the staircase nearly compromised by the violence of whatever had been imprisoned here. "Whatever made these," Yuki said, his voice echoing in the stairwell, with an eerie quality that made the words seem to come from somewhere else. "It was trying to get out. These marks are all pointing upward, and look here, you can see where it failed, where the stone was too thick, or the creature too weak. This was a prison, Thomas. This entire structure was designed to contain something that desperately wanted to escape." Yuki's seismic equipment painted a picture of what lay below that defied geological explanation and violated every principle of earth science he'd learned. A void 3 miles deep, too perfectly formed to be natural, too vast to be easily comprehended. The readings showed movement in the rock around the void, stress patterns that suggested the cavity had been deliberately created, and that the Earth was still adjusting to its presence thousands of years later, the planet itself wounded by whatever had happened here. "This void shouldn't exist," Yuki explained, showing Thomas the readings with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "The rock pressure at that depth should have collapsed any cavity this size millennia ago. The weight of the overlying stone alone should have crushed it flat. But look at these readings. The walls of the void are reinforced somehow. There are structures down there, support columns or frameworks that are preventing collapse. Engineering on a scale that's frankly terrifying. We're talking about structures that make our largest modern constructions look like children's toys." At a lower landing, where the air grew cold enough to hurt their lungs and frost formed on the stone, despite the desert heat above them, where every breath felt like inhaling needles of ice, Thomas found more tablets. These were different from the ones in the archive above, cruder in execution but somehow more powerful in their simplicity, more desperate in their message. They'd been carved directly into the walls of the staircase, as if whoever wrote them couldn't wait to find proper stone tablets, couldn't delay even that long in recording their message. David's translation was halting, as if he was reluctant to give voice to the words, as if speaking them aloud might somehow make them more real or give them power. "We have buried the last of them in the deep earth. We have sealed them with stone and prayer and the blood of our children. May they never rise again. May the stones above stand eternal as their prison. May those who come after remember what sleeps below and guard the seals with their lives. Let no curiosity break what desperation has bound. Let no ambition unseal what terror has locked away. Let no generation forget what we have done here and why we had no choice." He moved to another section, his voice growing quieter until it was barely audible, forcing them to lean closer to hear. "We were 40,000 when we began this work. We are 4,000 now. The sealing has cost us everything, but it must be done. They sleep in the deep places, but sleep is not death. We have seen them stir when we work too close. We have seen their eyes open in the darkness. We have seen them move in their stone sleep. We must bury them beyond all reaching, beyond all waking, even if it costs us the last of our people, even if we ourselves must be sealed in with them to maintain the watch." The words seemed to echo in the confined space, taking on weight and presence as if the ancient terror that had driven their creation still lingered in the stone. Lisa's camera captured Thomas's face as understanding settled over him like a shroud, as the full, terrible truth of what they'd discovered became undeniable. "They weren't building monuments to their gods or their kings," he said, his voice hollow with the weight of revelation. "They were building tombstones, markers over mass graves. The pyramids were never meant to celebrate anything. They were meant to warn us, to keep us away from what's buried underneath, and it cost them almost everything to do it. An entire civilization spent itself, burned itself out, making sure these creatures would never threaten the world again. They descended further into the cold and dark, and the temperature continued to drop in ways that made no scientific sense. At 300 feet below the archive chamber, ice began to form on the walls in thick sheets, thin crystals that caught their lights and threw them back in fractured patterns ice that shouldn't exist this deep in the Egyptian desert, in a place where the geothermal gradient should have made things warmer, not colder. The air grew thick and difficult to breathe, as if the atmosphere itself was fighting their intrusion, as if the very molecules were trying to warn them to turn back. Lisa noticed it first because she'd been filming their descent, documenting every step, her camera capturing details that the human eye might miss in the darkness and fear. When she reviewed the footage that evening back in the upper chamber, something made her pause and rewind, her heart beginning to race as she saw what the camera had captured. The dust on the stairs showed disturbance, recent disturbance, marks in the ancient sediment that indicated something had been using these stairs. "Thomas," she said quietly, pulling him aside from the others, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Look at this. These marks in the dust. They're fresh, days old at most. Maybe hours." The footage showed clear tracks in the dust, but they weren't human footprints, weren't anything that should exist. The impressions were longer, narrower, with marks suggesting clawed digits rather than toes, and there were dozens of them leading both up and down the staircase, as if something had been patrolling these passages, moving with purpose and intelligence. Yuki leaned in to study the footage, his scientific mind warring with what his eyes were showing him, desperate to find a rational explanation that would make this make sense. "That's impossible. The seal was intact. We verified it with multiple methods. No one has been down here since it was placed. Nothing could have gotten in or out." Thomas felt ice crystallize in his chest, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature, a fear that went deeper than rational thought. The seal at the top was intact, but we don't know what's below. We don't know if there are other passages, other ways in, connections to other chamber systems. He paused, forcing himself to voice the thought that was forming, the terrible possibility that made everything infinitely worse. Or out. We don't know if something has already found a way out. Ahmed, who'd been silent for most of the exploration, his nervousness growing with each descent, spoke up in a voice that carried the weight of generations. "In my village, we have stories. Old stories passed down from before Islam, before Christianity, before even the pharaohs. Stories about things that lived under the desert. The old people say the pyramids were built to keep them buried, to mark their graves so no one would ever dig there. We thought they were just tales to scare children, to keep them from wandering into dangerous places. But my grandfather, before he died, he told me something. He said his grandfather had been part of a restoration crew in the 1800s, working on the Great Pyramid. They broke through into a sealed chamber that wasn't on any map. Inside, they found bones. Not human bones. He said they were huge, wrong, arranged in ways that didn't make sense. He said they fled and sealed it back up, and they never spoke of it again except within the family. He made me promise to never work on the pyramids, to never dig too deep. I thought he was being superstitious. Now I think he was trying to save my life." "Why didn't you mention this before?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. Ahmed shrugged, his eyes haunted. "Would you have believed me? I barely believed it myself. Family stories, old superstitions, the ramblings of a dying old man. But now, after seeing all this, after touching these walls and feeling how wrong everything is down here." He gestured at the ancient staircase, the claw marks, the warning tablets, carved with desperate urgency. "Now I think maybe my grandfather wasn't telling fairy tales. Now I think maybe every generation has rediscovered this truth and been forced into silence by governments or fear or the sheer impossibility of making anyone believe it." On day 12, Thomas made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, however long or short that might be. He insisted on staying in the chamber overnight, conducting continuous seismic monitoring to track whatever was moving in the deep void below, to understand the patterns of activity. Yuki volunteered to stay with him, unwilling to let his colleague face the darkness alone, bound by the kind of friendship that forms between people who've shared impossible experiences. They set up equipment on the landing, where the warning tablets had been carved into the walls, running scans every 15 minutes, watching the displays for any change in the readings, any indication of what was happening in the depths below. The others returned to the surface camp, leaving Thomas and Yuki alone in the deep places beneath the plateau, alone with the weight of stone and time and ancient terror. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into an eternity of waiting and watching. Thomas tried to work, documenting the tablets, cross-referencing the translations with the seismic data, looking for patterns that might explain what they'd found. But his attention kept drifting to the staircase below them, to the darkness that seemed to pulse with a presence all its own, to the cold that deepened as midnight approached. Around midnight, Yuki's equipment registered the first anomaly. A slight vibration deep in the earth, too regular to be natural seismic activity, too rhythmic to be random geological movement. "Just a minor tremor," Yuki said, though his voice lacked conviction, his hands already moving across the keyboard to analyze the pattern. "This region gets them occasionally, nothing to worry about." But the vibrations continued, growing slightly stronger every few minutes, building in intensity with mathematical precision. By 1 in the morning, they were strong enough to feel, through the soles of their boots, a subtle trembling in the stone beneath their feet that made the ancient chamber feel suddenly less stable, less permanent. "That's not a tremor," Thomas said, watching the seismic displays with growing dread. "Look at the pattern. It's too regular, too rhythmic. That's not the earth moving. That's something in the earth moving, something large enough to make the stone vibrate." At 2:30 in the morning, when fatigue had dulled their senses and the darkness seemed to have weight and presence, when the cold had seeped into their bones and made thinking difficult, they heard it. A sound from somewhere below them on the staircase. Not the settling of ancient stone, or the whisper of air through cracks in the rock. This was rhythmic, purposeful, almost like breathing but deeper, resonating through the bedrock itself, felt in the chest as much as heard with the ears. Yuki's seismic equipment erupted with activity, alarms blaring in the silence with shocking volume that made both men jump. The displays showed something that shouldn't be possible, readings that violated every principle of geology Yuki had spent his career learning. "Thomas, there's movement in the void. Something massive, something that according to these readings has been completely still for thousands of years, just moved. It's not geological, it's not seismic activity. This is biological, or something like biological. Multiple sources, dozens of them, all moving in coordination." Thomas stared at the displays, watching the traces that indicated something 3 miles below them was shifting, stirring, responding perhaps to their presence or their breach of the seals, or simply waking because enough time had finally passed. The readings showed multiple sources of movement, dozens of them, all synchronized in that same rhythmic pattern, all pulsing in unison, like a heartbeat. "They're waking up," Thomas whispered, the words barely audible over the alarm. "Our drilling, our excavation breaking the seal. We didn't discover something, we woke something up. The warnings weren't about curses or supernatural vengeance. They were about something physical, something real, something that was deliberately imprisoned here, and we just broke open its cage. We've done exactly what the ancient warnings begged us not to do." The sound from below grew louder, rising up through the staircase with increasing volume. It wasn't breathing, Thomas realized, with creeping horror. It was vocalizing, communication, dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, calling to each other in the darkness after thousands of years of silence. Calls that started deep and rose in pitch until they became almost ultrasonic. Frequencies that made his teeth ache and his skull vibrate. "We need to leave," Yuki said, his hands shaking as he shut down the equipment with fumbling fingers. "We need to leave right now and seal this behind us. We need to do what the tablet said. Collapse it. Bury it. Run." They ran, abandoning equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, leaving everything behind in their panic. Later, when Thomas tried to remember the climb back to the surface, he could only recall fragments, disjointed images, burned into his memory with the clarity of trauma. The sound of their breathing, harsh and panicked, in the confined space, echoing back at them from stone walls. The beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly across ancient stone, and those terrible claw marks that seemed to be everywhere now, as if the walls themselves were covered in warnings they'd been too blind to see, and behind them, following them up through the darkness, that deep, rhythmic sound that was getting closer with every second, accompanied by other sounds now, sounds that might have been footsteps, or might have been claws on stone. Halfway up the spiral staircase, Thomas's flashlight caught movement below, a flicker of pale something in the absolute darkness where their lights didn't reach, something that moved with a fluidity that was wrong, that didn't match any terrestrial animal he knew, that seemed to flow through the darkness rather than walk through it. He didn't stop to look closer, didn't slow down to try to understand what he was seeing. He ran faster, his lungs burning, his legs screaming, pure animal panic overriding years of scientific training. When they burst out into the archive chamber, gasping and wild-eyed, hearts hammering hard enough to hurt, Ahmed was there. He'd come back down against orders to bring them coffee and food, concerned when they'd missed their scheduled check-in. The expression on his face told Thomas that he'd heard the sounds too, that he knew without being told that something fundamental had changed. "We need to collapse the staircase," Ahmed said without preamble, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "We need to seal it with explosives, bury it under 1,000 tons of rubble, just like the ancient tablet said, just like my grandfather's stories warned. This is the protocol. This is what has to be done." "We can't do that," Thomas protested, even as part of him, the part that wasn't a scientist, but just a terrified animal, knew Ahmed was right. "This is the most significant archaeological find in human history. This rewrites everything we know about our past. We need to document it, study it, understand it. This is too important to destroy." "No," Ahmed said firmly, his eyes hard, with the kind of resolve that comes from accepting terrible truths. "We need to do what our ancestors did. We need to bury it and forget we ever found it. Some things aren't meant to be studied, Dr. Reed. Some things are meant to stay buried. Some doors are sealed for good reason, and opening them doesn't lead to knowledge. It leads to death." But it was too late for that, too late to undo what they'd done. When they emerged from the drill hole into the pre-dawn desert, the world above seemed different somehow, changed in subtle ways that Thomas couldn't quite articulate. The stars were wrong somehow, or perhaps it was just that Thomas had seen something below that made the familiar sky seem fragile and temporary, made the comfortable illusion of human dominance seem like a joke the universe was playing. Over the next 48 hours, the phenomena accelerated beyond anything they could have anticipated. Local news channels reported ground tremors centered beneath the Giza Plateau, unusual seismic activity that had geologists baffled and frightened. The tremors followed that same rhythmic pattern Thomas and Yuki had recorded, pulsing up through the earth like a heartbeat, like the planet itself had developed a pulse. Several tourists posted videos online that went viral before being mysteriously taken down by unknown authorities. The footage showed shadows moving inside the Great Pyramid at night, visible through the entrance passage to anyone with a camera and night vision. The shapes moved in ways that hurt to watch, that seemed to fold through space rather than walk through it, that violated the basic laws of how things should move in three-dimensional space. Frame-by-frame analysis showed glimpses of forms that were almost human, but fundamentally wrong. Proportions that didn't match any known primate. Movements that suggested joints bending in directions that should be impossible. A security guard at the plateau was found unconscious near the Sphinx at dawn. His hair turned white, his eyes wide and staring. When he regained consciousness in the hospital, he claimed he'd seen something emerge from a previously unknown opening in the bedrock, a crevice that hadn't been there the day before. He described creatures that moved on all fours but could rear up to 7 or 8 feet tall, with elongated skulls and eyes that reflected light like an animal's tapetum lucidum, eyes that glowed with their own pale light. The authorities dismissed his account as heat stroke and dehydration, but the man refused to ever work at the site again, refused to even look at photographs of the pyramids, and eventually fled Egypt entirely. The Egyptian military arrived on day 14 with trucks and soldiers, and an authority that brooked absolutely no argument, no negotiation. The site was sealed immediately with steel barriers and concrete, guards posted with orders to shoot anyone who attempted to approach. Thomas's team was separated and taken to different facilities in Cairo for questioning, held in isolation from each other to prevent them from coordinating their stories. For 3 days, Thomas sat in a small room with no windows and answered questions from men who never gave their names, who wore suits instead of uniforms, who asked questions that suggested they already knew some of what he'd found, that this wasn't the first time they'd dealt with situations like this. What had they disturbed? What had they seen? What was the nature of the biological entities in the deep chambers? How many appeared to be active? Had any of the team been bitten or scratched? Had anyone shown signs of infection or behavioral changes? He told them everything, knowing they wouldn't believe him, knowing that it didn't matter anymore because whatever they'd awakened was awake now and seals broken, couldn't be restored. Doors opened, couldn't be easily closed again. On the 3rd day, they showed him satellite imagery that made his blood run cold. Thermal scans of the Giza Plateau that clearly showed heat signatures in the deep chambers, warm bodies moving through spaces that should have been empty for millennia, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Infrared detected movement patterns that suggested coordination, intelligence, hunting behavior. The images showed the heat, signatures spreading, moving through passage systems that shouldn't exist, approaching the surface through routes no one had mapped. "Dr. Reed," one of the suited men said, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge accumulated over decades or centuries. "You're not the first to find these chambers. There have been others over the centuries going back further than official records admit. The first documented incident was during the building of the Suez Canal in the 1860s, then again in the 1920s during restoration work. Each time the Egyptian government sealed the discovery and classified everything. Do you know why?" Thomas shook his head, though he could guess. Because every time someone disturbs the deep chambers, these creatures wake up, not all of them, not immediately, but enough. And each time people die, workers disappear, entire villages are evacuated under false pretenses. It takes years for them to go dormant again, to return to their sleep. Your expedition has awakened more of them than we've ever seen active at once. The thermal signatures suggest hundreds may be moving now, possibly thousands if they're throughout the entire chamber network. Thomas felt the weight of his actions crushing down on him like physical pressure. What happens now? The man stood, gathering his papers with the efficiency of someone who'd had this conversation before. "Now you sign the documents we give you, and you never speak of this again. We'll do what we've always done. We'll seal the site, post guards, wait for them to go dormant again. It will take time, perhaps years, possibly decades, but eventually they'll sleep again. They always do. Their metabolism requires dormancy. They can't stay active indefinitely. And if they don't, if this time they decide to come to the surface in numbers, if they've been awake long enough to remember what they lost, to want it back." The man paused at the door, and for the first time Thomas saw real fear in his eyes. Then we'll do what our ancestors did. We'll fight them with every weapon we have. And if we survive, if we somehow win, we'll bury them even deeper and build even larger monuments to mark their graves. That's been the pattern for 50,000 years, Dr. Reed. We're just the latest generation to learn why. We're just the newest keepers of a secret that predates civilization itself. They released him with papers to sign, dense legal documents that classified everything they'd found as matters of national security, that made disclosure a crime punishable by life imprisonment or worse. Non-disclosure agreements with penalties severe enough to guarantee silence to ensure that the comfortable illusion of human history would remain intact. The official story was already being written, already circulating through academic channels. They'd found empty chambers and their equipment had malfunctioned due to natural electromagnetic interference, a disappointing but ultimately mundane conclusion to their expedition. Nothing to see here. Move along. Thomas met with David and Yuki in a cafe far from government buildings, far from anyone who might be listening, in a crowded place where they could disappear into the noise of normal human life. They'd all kept copies of their data, files hidden in encrypted servers and physical media, stored in safety deposit boxes across 3 continents. Insurance against forced silence, evidence that could be released if anything happened to them. A dead man's switch that might not save them but might at least ensure the truth survived. It's not just Egypt, Yuki said, his laptop open to seismology databases that showed activity across the globe, a pattern that made terrible sense once you knew what to look for. Monitoring stations are detecting unusual vibrations from ancient sites worldwide. Machu Picchu in Peru, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, Easter Island, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Derinkuyu in Cappadocia, the Nazca Lines, Newgrange in Ireland, Karnak in France, all of them showing the same deep tremors, all of them built on foundations far older than official archaeology acknowledges. All of them, I think, marking the same kind of graves. He pulled up a map with red dots marking each location, the pattern forming a global network that suggested coordination, communication, or simply the response of a species that had once dominated the entire planet. I've been correlating the data with historical records. The tremors started approximately 6 hours after we breached the seal at Giza. Since then, they've been spreading, activating in sequence, like dominoes falling. It's as if breaking one seal triggered a response in all the others, as if they're all connected somehow, part of one vast network. David had spent his detention time researching on his phone, pulling up academic papers and ancient texts that he'd previously dismissed as mythology, seeing them now with new eyes that understood the terrible truth behind the symbols. Every major civilization has legends about something buried beneath their sacred sites, something sealed away that must never be disturbed. The Sumerians wrote about the Anunnaki sleeping in the deep earth, waiting for the stars to align for their return. The Maya spoke of Xibalba, the place of fear beneath the world, where the death gods resided in eternal twilight, waiting for the end of days. The Aboriginal Australians have stories about the Dreamtime beings who went below during the Age of Fire, retreating into the earth to escape the sun. He pulled up images of ancient texts on his phone, translations he'd been working on during his detention, seeing patterns he'd never noticed before. The Hopi tribe in America has legends about the ant people who lived underground and saved humanity from previous world destructions by teaching us to hide, to endure, to outlast the catastrophes above. The Tibetan Buddhists speak of Agartha, a subterranean kingdom inhabited by beings that predate surface humanity, beings that will emerge when the world above becomes uninhabitable. I thought these were myths, metaphors for spiritual concepts, stories people told to explain natural phenomena they didn't understand. What if they were warnings? What if they were history? What if every culture on Earth has been trying to tell us the same story for 50,000 years? Thomas stared at the cafe table, watching condensation drip down his water glass, seeing in the random patterns the chaos of a world order about to collapse. His mind was racing, connecting pieces he'd spent his career keeping separate, seeing a pattern that was vast and terrible. The flood myths, every ancient culture has them, a great deluge that destroyed the world. We've always attributed them to the end of the last ice age, to rising sea levels when the ice sheets melted. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the flood wasn't the catastrophe itself? "What do you mean?" Lisa asked, her camera resting on the table between them, no longer recording, but still present, still bearing witness. What if the flood wasn't the catastrophe? What if it was the solution? Thomas looked up at them, his eyes intense with the terrible clarity of understanding. Think about it. 50,000 years ago, these creatures, these hollow ones, dominated the planet. They were apex predators, intelligent, organized, perfectly adapted for their role. Our ancestors were on the verge of extinction, hiding in caves, barely surviving. Then something happened. A great dying. The tablet said the hollow ones began to sicken and die within a single generation. "And you think humans caused it?" David asked, leaning forward. "Not directly. But what if our ancestors figured out their weakness? The tablets mentioned that the hollow ones could enter dormancy, that they became still and cold like stone. What if they were vulnerable to certain environmental conditions? What if flooding their underground habitats, trapping them in water-filled chambers during their dormant state, was how ancient humans finally defeated them? What if the end of the Ice Age wasn't a natural disaster for us, but a weapon we learned to use?" Yuki's eyes widened as the implications sank in. The end of the Ice Age, global sea levels rising by over 300 feet, underground cave systems flooding worldwide. If these creatures were in dormancy, in underground chambers, if they needed dry spaces to survive their long sleeps, they'd be trapped, Thomas finished, drowned in their sleep, or forced to flee deeper into the earth, into chambers so deep that even if they woke, they could never dig their way back to the surface. And our ancestors made sure they stayed there. They spent generations sealing the chambers that remained dry, building massive stone monuments on top, creating markers that would last until the end of time. They turned the entire planet into a prison. Lisa had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up, pulling out her own laptop and opening files she'd been compiling. "There's something else. Something I found while reviewing all my footage, going through every frame looking for details we might have missed." She pulled up images side by side, ancient artwork from dozens of cultures. "Remember the biological illustrations we found in the corridors? The anatomical drawings of the hollow ones?" They nodded, remembering those disturbing images, carved with documentary precision. "I've been comparing them to other ancient artwork from around the world, looking for similarities, for any indication that other cultures had encountered the same things." She pulled up images side by side, the comparisons striking. An Egyptian carving of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the underworld, a Sumerian depiction of the Anunnaki with their elongated skulls and strange proportions, Mayan representations of their feathered serpent gods with their unusual body configurations, Aboriginal rock paintings of the Wandjina with their large eyes and distinctive head shapes, Hopi Kachina figures with their inhuman features. We've always interpreted these as stylized representations, artistic exaggerations, or symbolic imagery expressing spiritual concepts. But look at the proportions, the elongated skulls, the unusual limb configurations, the way the joints are positioned. What if these weren't stylizations? What if ancient artists were drawing what they actually saw? What if every culture's gods or demons or ancestors were actually memories of the hollow ones? What if human religion and mythology are just our species-wide attempt to make sense of and remember what we survived? The implications hung in the air like a physical presence. Thousands of years of human mythology, religion, and folklore potentially rooted in a single terrifying truth. We weren't the first intelligent species on Earth, and our ancestors remembered the ones that came before. Everything we built, everything we believed, everything we feared might trace back to that ancient war for survival. "There's more," David said quietly, pulling up research he'd been conducting in secret. "I've been investigating unexplained disappearances near ancient sites, going back decades looking for patterns. People vanishing near the pyramids, near Angkor Wat, near Machu Picchu. The official explanations are always mundane. Tourists getting lost, accidents, voluntary disappearances. But the numbers are statistically significant when you know what to look for. Hundreds of people over the past century, all near sites that our research suggests are built over sealed chambers, and the pattern accelerates. More disappearances in recent decades than in previous centuries." "You think the Hollow Ones have been taking people?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "I think they've been waking periodically, small numbers, brief periods of activity, before returning to dormancy. And during those times they feed. They need to. Even hibernating animals need food eventually. They're apex predators, Thomas. Their entire biology is built around hunting and feeding. If they wake even briefly, they need sustenance." Ahmed, who'd been sitting silently through the exchange, nursing his coffee, and looking like a man who'd aged years in days, finally spoke. "In my village, there's a reason we don't go into the deep desert at night. A reason why certain areas are forbidden, even to Bedouins, who know the sands better than anyone, who can navigate by stars and read stories in the dunes. The old people say there are places where the earth is hungry, where people go in and don't come out, where the sand itself will swallow you. We mark those places with stones, wide circles that everyone knows to avoid. No one questions it. No one asks why. It's just what you do if you want to live." "How many of these forbidden zones are there?" Yuki asked, leaning forward with intensity. "In Egypt? Dozens that I know of. Hundreds maybe, if you count all the regions, all the areas that locals avoid without even knowing why anymore. But it's not just Egypt. I have family in Libya, in Sudan, in Saudi Arabia. They all have forbidden zones, places marked by their ancestors as dangerous. We thought it was superstition, respect for the old ways. Maybe areas where there were unexploded mines from old wars or unstable ground. Now I wonder if it was something else. Now I wonder if those forbidden zones are distributed across the entire world, marking places where the seals are weak, where the Hollow Ones are close to the surface." Thomas felt the pieces clicking into place, forming a picture that was vast and terrible and had been hiding in plain sight for millennia. A global network of sealed chambers, marked by ancient monuments and forbidden zones and mythology that we dismissed as primitive superstition. A species that can survive in dormancy for thousands of years, waking periodically to feed before returning to sleep. And we just woke them up, not just in Egypt, but potentially worldwide. We broke the first seal, and it triggered a cascade reaction through the entire network. His phone buzzed, the vibration startling in the quiet intensity of their conversation. An email from his contact at the Swiss lab, the one that had processed their carbon dating samples. The message was brief and terrifying, written with the terseness of someone who wanted to communicate urgency without leaving a detailed electronic trail. "Per your request, we tested the biological samples you included with the stone. Results are impossible but verified, multiple times. DNA analysis shows no match to any known species, living or extinct. Closest genetic relatives are approximately 6 million years divergent from human lineage. Samples appear to be in a state of suspended metabolism. Cells are not dead, but not fully alive either. Mitochondria present but not functioning. No ATP production, but cellular structure intact. We don't understand how this is possible. Recommend immediate containment and isolation. We are destroying our samples and all records per safety protocols. Suggest you do the same. Do not contact us again. This facility is closing and relocating. Good luck. Thomas showed the email to the others, watching their faces as the implications sank in. No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, Yuki broke the silence, his voice hollow. 6 million years of divergent evolution. That would place the split around the time of the last common ancestor between humans and other great apes. These creatures aren't just another human species like Neanderthals, or Denisovans, or extinct hominids. They're something completely separate. A parallel evolution that developed intelligence along a completely different pathway. They're as different from us as we are from chimpanzees, maybe more so. And they were dominant when we were still learning to walk upright, David added, his voice carrying the weight of terrifying understanding. They had millions of years to develop as apex predators before we ever became a threat, before we were anything more than occasional prey. The only reason we survived is that they weren't expecting us to become competitive. By the time they realized we were a threat, by the time they understood that these weak, slow bipedal apes might actually challenge them, it was too late. We'd learned to cooperate, to plan, to use fire and tools. We'd become dangerous in ways they couldn't match. Lisa was scrolling through news feeds on her phone, her expression growing more concerned with each passing second. You need to see this. Reports are coming in from Peru. A research team exploring underground chambers at Chavin de Huantar has gone missing. All 12 members. Local authorities found their camp abandoned 3 days ago. Equipment still running, food half-eaten, tents undisturbed. It's like they vanished in the middle of their work. Cameras were found still recording. The footage shows... She paused, her face pale. The footage shows them working normally, and then screaming. Then the cameras go dark. But in the last few frames there are shapes. Movement in the shadows that shouldn't be possible. She scrolled further, her hands shaking slightly. And this. A sinkhole opened near Angkor Wat yesterday, swallowing part of an access road, and revealing that what appears to be a chamber system underneath. Locals say they heard sounds coming from the hole before sunrise. Sounds they described as singing or calling or the earth breathing. The Cambodian military has cordoned off the entire area. No one's allowed within a kilometre. Satellite imagery shows thermal signatures in the newly opened chambers. Easter Island, Yuki said, reading from his own phone, his voice tight. Unusual seismic activity detected beneath the Moai statues. Scientists are baffled because the island doesn't sit on any major fault lines, and there are reports of people seeing figures moving between the statues at night. Figures that disappear when approached, that seem to sink into the ground. The Chilean government has declared the island a contaminated area and is forcibly evacuating the population. They're saying it's chemical contamination from old military operations, but the timing... Thomas felt a wave of despair wash over him, cold and complete. This is my fault. We broke the first seal, and it triggered a cascade. We didn't just wake the ones under Egypt. We woke all of them. We sent a signal through their entire network that the seals were breaking, that humans were no longer maintaining the prison, and they're responding. No, Ahmed said firmly, his voice carrying unexpected strength. This was inevitable. If not you, then someone else. Humanity has been expanding, digging deeper, building more for centuries. Eventually someone was going to break through. Eventually someone was going to ignore the warnings and unseal what should have stayed sealed. At least now we know what we're dealing with. We can prepare. We can warn people. We can remember what our ancestors knew and forgot. Can we? Lisa asked, her voice carrying the despair they all felt. Who's going to believe us? We have evidence that will be dismissed as hoaxes. Testimony that will be called conspiracy theories. The governments of the world are already covering this up, and they've been covering it up for centuries, apparently. They have entire departments dedicated to suppressing this information, to maintaining the illusion that human history is simple and comprehensible. Then we make them listen, Thomas said, a new resolve forming in his voice, hardening into determination. We have footage, samples, translations of ancient texts. We have seismic data from multiple sites worldwide. We have documentation that can't be easily dismissed. We release everything simultaneously, flood the internet with evidence before they can suppress it all. We make it impossible to ignore. They'll destroy us, Yuki warned, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who understood how power protected itself. Our careers, our reputations, possibly our lives. You've seen how seriously they take this. The military presence, the classifications, the threats. This isn't just academic suppression. This is national security at the highest levels. They're going to do that anyway, Thomas replied, meeting each of their eyes in turn. At least this way, people will have a chance to prepare, to understand what's happening when the tremors start, when the disappearances increase, when the things under the earth finally decide to come to the surface in numbers too large to hide. At least this way, when it happens, humanity won't be completely blind. David nodded slowly, understanding crystallizing into acceptance. The ancient texts were specific about one thing. The Hollow Ones have a collective intelligence. They communicate across vast distances through means we don't understand. They coordinate in ways that demonstrate consciousness that developed along completely alien pathways. That's what made them such effective predators, what allowed them to dominate an entire planet. If the ones under Egypt are fully awake and calling to the others, sending signals through the earth itself, then it's only a matter of time before they all wake up, Thomas finished, the terrible logic of it undeniable. And this time they'll be angry. They'll remember being dominant. They'll remember what we did to them. They'll want revenge for 50,000 years of imprisonment, for being buried alive in the dark, deep places of the earth while we walked freely above. 6 months passed. 6 months of Thomas living in a small apartment in Berlin, blacklisted from every university he'd ever worked with, his papers rejected without review from journals that had once competed to publish his work, his reputation systematically destroyed by colleagues who'd once respected him. But he wasn't idle. He continued his research with obsessive focus, correlating data from monitoring stations worldwide, tracking the spread of seismic anomalies, documenting every unexplained disappearance near ancient sites, building a comprehensive database of evidence that grew larger and more damning every day. The pattern was undeniable if you knew what to look for, if you had the key to unlock the code. The tremors were increasing in frequency and intensity following a mathematical progression that suggested coordination. The disappearances were accelerating along a curve that matched predator population growth, and the governments of the world were working overtime to suppress information, to dismiss reports, to maintain the illusion that everything was normal even as the fabric of that normality frayed at the edges. But it wasn't normal. Nothing was normal anymore. Thomas had contacts now, a growing network of people who'd seen similar phenomena and been silenced, who'd encountered evidence and been forced to suppress it. Other researchers who'd found chambers and been shut down. Military personnel who'd been involved in containment operations and were haunted by what they'd seen. Indigenous peoples whose oral traditions spoke of the things beneath the earth and who recognized the signs of their awakening. They shared information carefully, encrypted messages and coded language, aware that they were being monitored, but unwilling to stay silent, bound together by the terrible knowledge they carried. A former Brazilian geologist who'd found chambers beneath the Amazon that predated the rainforest itself. A Cambodian archaeologist who'd been ordered to seal discoveries and destroy his documentation. An Australian anthropologist who'd been studying Aboriginal cave paintings and recognized the creatures depicted in Thomas's photographs. a Russian mining engineer who'd encountered something in the deep tunnels beneath Siberia that killed 17 men before the entrance was sealed with explosives and concrete. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle, another confirmation that the Hollow Ones weren't isolated to Egypt, weren't our local phenomenon, but a global reality that had been systematically suppressed for generations. Lisa had remained his closest ally, still filming, still documenting, building a comprehensive archive that grew more damning with each passing week. She'd gathered footage from dozens of sources, testimonies from witnesses around the world, satellite imagery showing thermal anomalies beneath ancient sites, seismic recordings that captured sounds no geological process could explain. David continued translating ancient texts with renewed urgency, finding more warnings in languages that had been dead for millennia, discovering that almost every ancient writing system contained some reference to the things below, the sleepers in darkness, the prisoners who must never wake. Yuki maintained his seismic monitoring network, expanding it with volunteer stations operated by other scientists who'd seen the data and understood what it meant. The network now covered 43 countries, monitoring tremors at ancient sites, tracking patterns of activity that painted a terrifying picture. The Hollow Ones weren't just waking up. They were organizing, coordinating, excavating new passages between chamber systems that had been isolated for thousands of years. They'd discovered something else in those 6 months, something that made the situation infinitely worse. The tremors followed a pattern, a rhythm that matched what Thomas and Yuki had heard in the deep chambers. But the pattern was evolving, becoming more complex, more sophisticated. The Hollow Ones were communicating across continents through seismic waves, using the Earth itself as a medium for signals that carried information in frequencies and patterns that suggested intelligence far different from human thought but no less capable. They're not just waking up, Yuki explained during one of their encrypted video conferences, his face haggard from months of sleepless monitoring. They're organizing, planning. The seismic signatures suggest they're excavating, creating new passages between their chambers. But it's coordinated, Thomas. Sites thousands of miles apart are digging in synchronized patterns. They're building a network, connecting isolated populations, creating infrastructure for something larger. Preparing for what? Lisa asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer and was hoping desperately to be wrong. No one wanted to answer that question directly. The implications were too vast, too terrible to voice. But they all understood. The Hollow Ones weren't preparing to hide. They were preparing to reclaim what they'd lost. Lisa had set up her camera in Thomas's apartment for what they all knew might be a final interview, a last testament before the situation escalated beyond their control. If things went as badly as Thomas suspected they might, this could be the last chance to get his story on record, to create a document that might survive, even if they didn't, to leave evidence for whatever came after. The apartment was sparse, most of Thomas's possessions sold to fund his research. Maps covered the walls, red pins marking ancient sites, blue pins marking recent disappearances, green pins marking seismic anomalies. Lines connected them in patterns that suggested a global network of chambers, a vast underground territory that humanity had never known existed beneath their cities and monuments. "What do you want people to understand?" Lisa asked, the camera's red light steady in the dim room. Thomas looked into the lens, and in his eyes was the weight of knowledge that couldn't be unlearned, a burden that had aged him years in just 6 months, that had stripped away the comfortable certainties of his former life. We tell ourselves that we inherited Earth from the dinosaurs, 65 million years of evolution, leading inevitably to us, to human dominance, to civilization and technology, and mastery over nature. But that's not the whole story. That's a comfortable fiction we've told ourselves because the truth is too terrifying to accept, too devastating to the narrative of human supremacy we've built our entire civilization around. He paused, gathering his thoughts, trying to find words adequate to convey the magnitude of what they'd discovered. There was something in between, something that ruled this planet when our ancestors were still learning to control fire, when we huddled in caves and hoped the darkness wouldn't notice us, when we were prey rather than predators. They were the dominant species for millions of years, evolving intelligence and social structures and hunting strategies that made them perfect apex predators. And we didn't defeat them through superior strength or technology. We survived them through luck and patience and the willingness to do whatever it took to ensure they could never threaten us again. We survived by being small enough to hide, adaptable enough to endure, and patient enough to outlast them. Our ancestors knew about them. They found their remains, their cities carved from bedrock, their graveyards in the deep places, and instead of studying them, instead of disturbing them, instead of trying to understand them, ancient humans made a choice. They buried them deeper. They sealed them away with everything they had, with stone and earth and prayer and blood and the lives of entire generations. They built monuments of warning that lasted for 50,000 years. Monuments so massive and mysterious that we're still studying them today, still marveling at them, never quite understanding what they were really for. Never asking why every ancient civilization on Earth felt compelled to build massive stone structures over certain locations, why they invested resources that should have gone to survival into creating markers that would outlast empires. Thomas's voice grew quieter, more intense, as if the weight of what he was saying pressed down on him physically. But we're not as wise as our ancestors. We don't listen to warnings carved in stone. We don't believe in monsters that science hasn't catalogued. We don't respect the fears of people we consider primitive and superstitious. We see forbidden zones and ancient seals and desperate warnings, and we think, how interesting, how quaint, how irrational those ancient people were. We think we're smarter, more advanced, more capable of understanding reality. And then we dig, we drill, we break through seals that were placed by people who understood exactly what they were imprisoning, who sacrificed everything to keep us safe. And now, after all this time, after all those millennia of sleep in the cold, deep earth, we've woken them up. Not just in Egypt, but worldwide. We've broken the first seal, and it triggered all the others, like dominoes falling in slow motion. The Hollow Ones are waking up, and they remember everything. They remember being the dominant species. They remember hunting our ancestors through forests and grasslands. They remember when we were prey, when we were food, when we were nothing more than clever apes that sometimes got away. They remember being sealed away, imprisoned in darkness for longer than human civilization has existed. And they're angry. He leaned forward, his intensity filling the frame, his conviction absolute. The tremors you're hearing about in the news, the ones being dismissed as normal seismic activity or fracking-related disturbances. That's them communicating, coordinating, excavating new passages through solid rock. The disappearances near ancient sites that authorities explain away as accidents or voluntary vanishings or human trafficking. That's them feeding, regaining strength after millennia of dormancy, rebuilding populations that were nearly extinct. The strange sightings, the shadows that move wrong, the things people see at night near the pyramids and Easter Island and Angkor Wat and Machu Picchu. That's them testing their limits, exploring the surface world that's changed so much since they were last awake, learning about the creatures that imprisoned them and how vulnerable we might be. We're running out of time. The governments of the world know this. They've known for longer than we realized, for centuries perhaps. They've been fighting a secret war, containing breaches, suppressing information, doing everything they can to keep people ignorant and complacent. But you can't fight what you won't acknowledge. You can't prepare for a threat you refuse to believe in, and by keeping this secret, by maintaining the comfortable lie, they've ensured that when the truth becomes undeniable, when the Hollow Ones finally come to the surface, in numbers too large to hide, humanity will be completely unprepared. Thomas's voice dropped to almost a whisper, forcing viewers to lean closer, to focus completely on his words. They're coming. Not next year or next decade, but soon. The seismic data shows they're creating connected tunnel systems between the major chamber networks, linking populations that have been isolated for millennia. They're not just waking up, they're uniting. 50,000 years ago, they nearly drove humanity to extinction, even though they were scattered and uncoordinated, even though our ancestors could hide in caves and remote valleys where the Hollow Ones rarely hunted. This time, they'll be organized. They'll be prepared. They'll know we're the enemy. They'll remember what we did to them. So what do? How do we survive? He shook his head slowly, the gesture carrying the weight of months of desperate searching for answers that might not exist. I don't know if we can. Our ancestors barely survived them with a global population of maybe a few 100,000 people who could disappear into the wilderness, who could hide in places the Hollow Ones couldn't easily reach, who could outlast them through sheer patience and reproductive advantage. There are 8 billion of us now. We can't hide, we can't run. We've built our cities right on top of the monuments our ancestors placed as warnings. We live on their graves, and we're about to find out what happens when the dead refuse to stay buried, when prison walls crack and the inmates remember exactly why they were locked away. The camera captured the maps behind him, the network of sights and disappearances and anomalies that painted a picture of something vast stirring beneath humanity's feet. But maybe if people know the truth, if they understand what's coming, some will survive. Maybe if we remember what our ancestors knew, if we learn again to fear the deep places and respect the warnings carved in stone, if we prepare instead of deny, then humanity might endure. We survived them once. Perhaps we can do it again, but not through ignorance, not through denial, only through acceptance of what we're facing and the courage to do whatever it takes to ensure our species continues. Lisa's documentary circulated online in fragments, released simultaneously across dozens of platforms to prevent easy suppression. Within hours, it had been viewed millions of times, shared across social media, translated into multiple languages. The reaction was predictable. Most dismissed it as elaborate fiction, an impressive piece of horror storytelling, or viral marketing for some upcoming film. But certain people watched it very carefully. Intelligence agencies flagged it for analysis. Military analysts studied the seismic data Thomas had included. Scientists who'd seen their own unexplained data and said nothing for fear of ridicule watched it with growing recognition. Religious leaders whose ancient texts spoke of end times and things emerging from beneath the earth watched it with the cold certainty of prophecy being fulfilled. The comment sections filled with debates about CGI and special effects, about government cover-ups and ancient alien theories, about hoaxes and mental illness. Some people believed, most didn't. But the video kept spreading, kept being shared, kept finding audiences who looked at the evidence and felt a primal recognition that this was truth disguised as fiction. Reality presented as horror story because the truth was too terrible to state plainly. The satellite imagery that leaked shortly after the documentary told a story that couldn't be easily dismissed by anyone with access to the right databases. Multiple agencies had thermal scans of the Giza Plateau at night showing heat signatures in the deep chambers where no heat source should exist, dozens of warm bodies moving through passages that shouldn't exist. Infrared detected movement in spaces that were supposed to be empty, patterns that suggested organized activity, hunting behavior, territorial marking. Ground-penetrating radar from sites around the world showed the same thing. Massive underground chambers, networks of tunnels being actively excavated, and signatures that suggested biological entities in numbers that grew larger with each passing week. 3 weeks after the interview, on a cold September evening, when the first hints of autumn touched Berlin, Dr. Thomas Reid disappeared. His apartment was found empty, his research materials gone, his computer wiped with professional thoroughness. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of where he'd gone, no evidence of forced entry or foul play. The Berlin police filed a missing person report and quietly closed the case when no leads emerged, instructed from above to stop asking questions. But Thomas's friends knew better. Lisa received a brief encrypted message 2 days after his disappearance, sent through anonymous networks that made tracing impossible. They came for me, not the government, the others. I saw them in the shadows outside my window, watching, waiting. I'm going deep, following the passages, trying to find where they're congregating, trying to understand their plans. If I don't come back, release everything. People deserve to know. People deserve a chance to prepare. The seals are breaking faster now. I can feel it. Time is running out. Tell the world that some of us tried to warn them. Tell them we tried. That was the last anyone heard from him. The Egyptian government maintained its silence, a wall of official denials and classified reports. The Giza Plateau remained closed to tourists indefinitely, the official explanation citing structural concerns and ongoing conservation work that might take years or decades to complete. No timeline for reopening was given. Military presence around the site increased dramatically, with guard posts established at quarter-mile intervals around the entire plateau, creating a perimeter that no civilian could penetrate. Surface-to-air missiles were deployed, ostensibly for terrorism prevention, but positioned in ways that suggested they were meant to contain something trying to leave rather than prevent something from entering. Deep below the sand, in chambers the public would never see, scientists and soldiers worked around the clock, monitoring the deep places, tracking movement, trying to understand the nature of what they were dealing with. Watching screens that showed thermal signatures, moving through ancient passages, multiplying, organizing, preparing for something the analysts didn't want to imagine. Similar operations were established at major sites, worldwide, quietly and without public announcement. Machu Picchu became a military zone overnight. Peruvian special forces establishing a perimeter and evacuating nearby villages under the pretense of drug enforcement operations. Angkor Wat was closed to tourists and sealed. Cambodian military moving in with construction equipment to collapse passages and fill chambers with concrete. Easter Island's tourist industry collapsed when the Chilean government declared the island a contaminated area and forcibly relocated its population to the mainland, leaving only military personnel to monitor the moai and the passages beneath them. Göbekli Tepe was buried again, this time deliberately. Thousands of tons of concrete pumped into the excavation until the ancient stones were hidden once more, beneath an artificial hill ringed with motion sensors and guard towers. But it was too late for containment. The seals were broken. The warnings had gone unheeded, and deep beneath the surface, in chambers that predated human civilization by tens of thousands of years, something ancient was stirring in numbers too vast to contain, too determined to stop. Yuki continued monitoring his seismic network from Tokyo, watching the tremors spread and intensify, tracking patterns that suggested coordination on a scale that defied comprehension. The Hollow Ones were excavating a connected network of tunnels between the major chamber systems, creating highways beneath the earth that would allow them to move freely across continents without ever emerging into sunlight. North America to South America through passages beneath the Atlantic floor. Europe to Africa through new tunnels that bypassed the Mediterranean. Asia to Australia along routes that followed ancient land bridges, long submerged by rising seas. They're not preparing to come to the surface, Yuki realized during a video call with David and Lisa, his revelation carrying the weight of terrible certainty. They're preparing to reclaim the subsurface. They're going to stay underground, but they're going to make it impossible for us to use anything below ground level. Mining, drilling, subway systems, underground infrastructure, basements, sewers, all of it will be in their territory, and anyone who goes below will be prey. They're not going to invade our world. They're going to reclaim theirs and make sure we can never imprison them again. David had continued his translation work with obsessive focus, and what he'd found in the oldest texts was chilling. The tablets described periods when the Hollow Ones were active before the final sealing, times when they emerged to hunt on the surface. But these periods were always brief, just a few years or decades before they returned to dormancy. The ancient writers believed the Hollow Ones found the surface uncomfortable, that sunlight weakened them somehow, that certain environmental conditions made extended surface activity impossible. That's why our ancestors were able to survive. The Hollow Ones couldn't hunt at all times. There were safe periods during the day, safe seasons when the surface was too bright or too warm, refuges that the Hollow Ones couldn't penetrate. But now, Lisa asked, though she already knew the answer, could see it in David's haunted expression. Now we've changed the environment in ways our ancestors never imagined. Light pollution means true darkness is rare near human habitation. The electromagnetic fields from our technology are everywhere, creating a background noise that might mask our presence or confuse their senses. Climate change is altering temperature patterns globally, making some regions warmer and others colder in ways that might affect them. Air pollution has changed the chemical composition of the atmosphere. We've weakened the ozone layer, altered weather patterns, released chemicals into the environment that didn't exist 50,000 years ago. He paused, letting the implications sink in. What if the conditions that made the surface uncomfortable for them are disappearing? What if the modern world we've created is actually more hospitable to them than the ancient one was? What if all our technological progress has inadvertently been preparing the world for their return? In those final weeks before everything changed, before the tremors became impossible to ignore, and the disappearances too numerous to explain away, and the comfortable lies collapsed under the weight of undeniable reality, a few people tried to warn others. Scientists published papers that were immediately retracted under pressure from funding agencies and government departments. Journalists investigated stories that their editors killed, finding their sources intimidated into silence or simply vanishing. Religious leaders preached about the end times and were dismissed as alarmists or mentally unstable, their warnings lost in the noise of modern media. But some people listened. Some people looked at the evidence, the warnings in ancient texts, the seismic data, the thermal signatures, the pattern of disappearances, and they made preparations. They moved away from major ancient sites, selling homes at a loss to relocate to regions with no archaeological significance. They reinforced their basements with steel and concrete, creating bunkers that could be sealed from the inside. They stocked supplies for long sieges, understanding that if the Hollow Ones emerged, there might be no government response, no rescue coming. They armed themselves and trained and waited, the preppers and survivalists who'd always been dismissed as paranoid, suddenly seeming prescient. Most people, though, continued their normal lives. They went to work, sent their children to school, planned vacations, argued about politics and celebrities and sports and all the small concerns that filled human consciousness. They lived as if the world wasn't changing, as if the ground beneath them wasn't honeycombed with passages filled with ancient predators that were organizing for the first time in 50,000 years. They maintained the comfortable illusion because the alternative was too terrifying to accept. Ahmed had returned to his village in Egypt, to his family and his people, determined to protect them with the knowledge he carried. He told them what he'd seen, what he'd learned in the deep places. The old people nodded, as if they'd always known, as if their entire lives had been preparing for this confirmation. The young people were skeptical until the tremors started, until the forbidden zones began expanding, until people started disappearing from the edges of the village at night, until the old warnings became new realities. Then they remembered the old stories. They remembered why certain areas were forbidden, why their ancestors had built their homes in specific patterns, why the ancient markers had been placed and maintained for generations without anyone questioning why. They remembered that survival sometimes meant accepting truths that seemed impossible, believing in monsters that science denied, respecting warnings that seemed irrational. They organized watches, no one going out alone after dark. They marked the forbidden zones with new stones, creating visible boundaries that even children understood never to cross. They taught their children the old prayers, the old protections, the old ways of recognizing danger that predated Islam and Christianity and every historical religion. They prepared to survive the way their ancestors had survived, through vigilance and community, and the willingness to believe that some things lurked in darkness that were older and more terrible than any human evil. In Berlin, Lisa continued her work alone, compiling everything into a comprehensive archive that grew more complete with each passing day. Video footage, translations, seismic data, thermal imagery, witness testimonies from around the world. Everything Thomas and David and Yuki had gathered, plus new material that arrived daily from sources who'd seen the documentary and wanted to contribute their own evidence. She stored it in multiple locations, encrypted it with military-grade security, prepared to release it all if the worst happened. She knew it might not matter. She knew most people wouldn't believe it even with overwhelming evidence. But she also knew that some people would, and those people might be the ones who survived what was coming. Deep beneath the desert, in chambers that Thomas Reed had discovered and fled from, in passages that now connected to systems around the world, something was happening that would change the course of human history. The Hollow Ones were fully awake now, not dozens or hundreds, but thousands of them, perhaps tens of thousands. Populations that had been isolated for millennia, now in contact through newly excavated passages. They moved through the ancient corridors with purpose, communicating in frequencies that made stone vibrate and resonate, coordinating in ways that demonstrated intelligence that had developed along paths completely alien to human thinking, but no less sophisticated, perhaps more so for being optimized for a completely different environment. They remembered 50,000 years was nothing to them, a brief uncomfortable sleep, a temporary setback. They remembered the world as it had been when they hunted freely, and humanity cowered in caves, when their kind numbered in the millions and dominated every continent, when no other species challenged their supremacy. They remembered being the apex predators of an entire planet, the culmination of millions of years of evolution that had perfected them for their role. They remembered the betrayal, the sealing, the long darkness. They remembered their dying, their desperation, their final retreat into dormancy as the world changed around them in ways they couldn't fight. They remembered the small, weak creatures that had somehow survived them, that had somehow learned to trap them, to bury them, to build mountains of stone over their prisons. And they remembered what prey tasted like. The pyramids stood eternal against the sky, monuments that had once drawn tourists from around the world who marveled at their construction and debated their purpose. But to those few who truly understood, they were something else entirely. They were tombstones marking mass graves. They were prison markers warning of dangers sealed below. They were the last testament of ancestors who'd faced extinction and survived by burying their nightmares rather than defeating them, who'd spent entire civilizations ensuring their descendants would be safe. But nightmares don't die. they only sleep. And after 50,000 years of darkness, after millennia of forced stillness in the deep earth, after an eternity of imprisonment in the cold places beneath humanity's greatest monuments, they were fully awake now. They were organized now. They were united now. They remembered what it felt like to move freely, to hunt without fear, to feed without restriction. They remembered what it felt like to be dominant. And deep in those ancient chambers, in the cold places beneath humanity's greatest monuments and forgotten cities and pristine wilderness areas that had once been their hunting grounds, eyes that hadn't opened in 50,000 years were watching, waiting, planning. The warnings had gone unheeded. The seals were broken. The ancestors' sacrifice had been forgotten. And now, in the 21st century, with 8 billion humans living in blissful ignorance, on the surface, humanity was about to remember why our earliest ancestors had been so afraid of the dark. The tremors continued, growing stronger each day, pulsing through the earth with the rhythm of something vast awakening. The disappearances accelerated, the numbers climbing into the thousands as the hollow ones fed and grew stronger and bolder. And around the world, in the deep places beneath ancient monuments and modern cities, in passages that connected continents in a network that had taken 50,000 years to build and mere months to reactivate, something was preparing for the moment when patience ended and action began. The hollow ones were awake. They were organized. They were united. They were hungry. And this time they would not go quietly back to sleep. This time they would reclaim what had been taken from them. This time humanity would learn what it meant to be prey again. The earth trembled. The darkness stirred. And somewhere in the deep places where even light feared to go, something smiled with too many teeth and began to climb.